Today's topic is breaking the trauma trap with essential oils. So we're going to talk about essential oils, but we're also going to talk about a lot of other things as far as trauma, period, and how actually essential oils can segue into that. It's not enough to just look at things and say, there's an energy quality to things, and so we balance the energy. That is beyond basic. And we can't necessarily measure every single thing and quantify it. We don't necessarily have the technology to do that. And that doesn't mean that things don't exist because of that absence. But as much as possible, we really can explain these dynamics far beyond just this is a balancing frequency or, energy imparts XYZ quality. Obviously, intuitively, we feel these things to be true. But, being able to have some language around them to describe them, some visuals, and the ability to kind of see the steps and the continuum of how that works, I think is very important for people so that we can actually apply things in the right order. So this lecture is given by myself, Veronica, hosted by Root Cause Clinic. Let's first start by defining what trauma is. So trauma is not necessarily the what. It's about what happens inside of you as a result of the what. This is why trauma can be subjective. Something that might be seemingly horrific in one person's case may affect, two different people, two different soldiers per se, differently. Trauma is the tension that remains long after the incident has passed. And in Physics Meets Physiology, I refer to what's called the crystalline continuum, where that we have different condensation or thickening points, if you will, that generally take a template or a design, right? And harden that or crystallize that, depending on how static that energy is. And that's how we come into the point of matter. That's a short version of that, but that's kind of just to paint the image there for you. So again, trauma being kind of the crystallization of this in the body as kind of its cries that it crystallizes in the tissues. Now, there are different types of trauma. We have acute trauma. This can be a single traumatic incident. We can have chronic and or repeated or prolonged incidents that kind of serve as a continuum. And then there's complex trauma, which is varied acute and chronic multi-complex trauma patterns. So we can have ongoing trauma alongside some very still acute traumatic incidents which have stayed with us. Not to mention that trauma can actually be something that is transferred to us. It does not have to begin with us. In Physics Meets Physiology, I go through a lot as far as our toolbox of how we deal with trauma. So when we think about what makes this person deal with this trauma differently than this person, why is that, right? I mean, genetics are just the crystallization of that. It's not necessarily the true software that animates that. That is actually given to us, by many different types of lineage that we have and what they have experienced. Some of that gets encoded, hardwired into the actual DNA, but not all of it does. It doesn't mean that it's not there. So trauma can be transferred generationally, and this does not have to begin with you. And aspects which were not corrected through the other generational lines will concentrate in subsequent generations. Those of you familiar with homeopathy will know that the dilution, the amount of times that we're actually diluting that substance, that makes it more potent. It actually doesn't make it, less potent. In homeopathics, there actually isn't any part per billionth, or there shouldn't be at least, which is why the FDA actually regulates that field, because some of those substances are actually toxic if you were to ingest them. So they are to be diluted out. And the amount of dilutions or secessions that it will go through, that actually increases, again, the potency, becomes stronger. So things that might have started, 7, 8 generations ago, though that, you may think that that has gotten weaker or thinned itself out, you're just removed from that maybe as far as memory goes or that kind of close proximity. You didn't know your great-great-grandfather. But that can actually condense and become a lot stronger as we go through the generations. So let's say that you had, a great-grandfather who was an alcoholic. And then you maybe see that that was something that through the grandfather and through the father has also passed its way down. You might notice that that has actually been something harder for, let's say, a child or your son to deal with, as opposed to what you might have seen in the generations past, exactly because it has actually condensed. Now, I have an actual image that I think is very powerful here. This is on the left, a drop of blood, and it is actually put through a holographic projector. And so we're able to see things associated with the blood that we normally wouldn't see with the naked eye. On the right, we have what is considered a lotus of life. And I teach this as the master template that is. So if you're familiar with things like flower of life, where that we have the sequences of how, for example, a sunflower will print out its form. That actually is kind of almost an inversion of what you see here. So this is kind of what we see with the grandmaster, unified field or 0 point, or, the be all end all point, where there's no time, there's no, past or present, everything is just kind of one. And so this is kind of as singularity as it gets, right? This is the concept that we go over in Physics Meets Physiology that is extensively looked at throughout the course of the entire, 1,200 slides. But to summarize it, that is kind of the singularity, right? Now on the left, you have the blood, which is the materic, right? So that's a physical crystallization that we've got, right, in the world of matter. And you can see that the template, which we would not see if we didn't have this holographic magnifier, is there. So it is there despite the absence of us being able to, with the regular, barometer of senses, be able to see that. So when you look at DNA, we don't doubt that there is the hardwired DNA. We have genes. We've, done the Human Genome Project, and they said this was going to cure everything, and we were never going to have problems again because we were going to be able to source any type of issue and be able to correct it, right? Well, where are we now? Some 30 years later, have we done that? No, we haven't. And that's because that there's more to the story than what you have in this hardwired, blood that you have with the DNA that is the physical. That's just the materic. There is the etheric portion. So if you really want to know where this kind of generational programming lies, it's in that, light field that you see there. And if you notice, there is that same Lotus of Life template that you see here on the right. So you could look at that materic as kind of being, our duality or our world of separation, right? Those of you who might, enjoy any references to Genesis, think about how, Adam and Eve, upon, having this ability to see that they were unclothed, this is really, in my opinion, a metaphorical reference for the light. The light came because they shed from singularity into duality. When you look on this continuum of how we get to light, it actually comes out of sound in the physics that we teach in Physics Meets Physiology. And so you're looking at this as kind of the middle ground on the left between this duality world with the physical blood and also, this etheric world from which we all actually come from, right? At some point it condenses. And so it's the same pattern you see with the blood. It condenses there to that kind of vortex center, and you see that same kind of pattern represented in the singularity state. Now, the trauma, again, does not begin with you. It doesn't also end with you either. It's generational. So furthermore, anything that does not exclusively transcribe between the generations via the hardwired genetic modifications can continue to go through in this software. You can look at it almost as though that this is a OneDrive that everybody in your descendants has shared. And so when you go in, or a Google Drive, right, and you change that file, you don't just change it for yourself, you're actually changing it for everybody. So anyone attached or tethered to that is going to then have that kind of new update of information when people think about, oh my gosh, I heard that if I do this work, it's for my generation, but also for my children. That seems pretty wacky. How could that be? Well, it's quite literal. And many of us wouldn't deny the kind of psychological factors of the direct proximity of how we act and how our children will turn out, or those who we have relationships with. But there's more to that, right? Because even those physical actions, what has inspired them is a software, right? That's software. And that's what you're looking at here. So case in point is that trauma can actually be transcribed and transferred, not just through the DNA or the hardwired type of communication, but also electromagnetically through the software. Looks like I have a question. Let me see if I can answer this here. Meryl has said, yes, I have noticed pattern in mother. It's the emoji's covering your comment. Mother stronger in child. Yes. And Cara has said the life is in the blood. Absolutely. If you look through, again, you could go through the biblical text. You can go through many other types of, the Chinese medicine system, the Vedics, etc. Native Americans, there is so much reference to the blood for this reason. And when you look in Physics Meets Physiology, we have a whole section about how does blood have this viscoelastic property? Like, how does it have this magnetic force to defy the laws of physics? So that's what it actually does inside of you. And so when we look at things like this, it makes a lot more sense to see that spiral, which is really a torsion field. And we're going to talk about torsion fields in your tissue and how that actually creates the dynamics that seemingly aren't explained by this Newtonian world of physics. So on to the next screen. Now we're at the point of tension. So I think everything really just comes down to tension. And, you can't separate tension, which tension is described in physics as a force. You can't separate that from energy. They're related, but energy and tension are not exactly interchangeable. They're not exactly the same thing. So within the field that I just showed you on the prior screen, all that empty space that you saw in between isn't really empty. We teach the etheric anatomical model, which is essentially postulating that there is a density medium where there's some sort of thickening in between that space. It's not just empty, because in order to create something with energy, energy needs a canvas to do that, right? If energy congregates in one area, how can it still yet create if there's not something to kind of, tense against, right? And so what you'll see in nature and what we teach in Physics Meets Physiology is that there is a continuum of this lattice matrix from the cosmos that you've just seen. Actually, that was beyond the cosmos, that's the singular field, but going even into the cosmos and, the galaxies and the way that Earth is represented, our lattice matrix within Earth, our lattice matrix within the human body, within the single cell, as you're looking at here. That same kind of etheric web of design is there. Now, the strings, if you will, are kind of like where energy is congregated enough or crystallized enough that you actually see some matter form. In between all that empty space, though, is not empty. There's actually still a dynamic of density, and that density is what tension actually pushes. It pushes or pulls it accordingly, and that's how you get those striations that you get in the tissue and any other type of template that we're looking at, whether that this is something that we can't see, such as what's in with the etheric template, and or something that we can see, which is something crystallized like the tissues here before you. So this force field, which is essentially what is created there, is really what is kind of navigating the way that we end up taking just something that we merely sense, or are tensed by, and translating this, transducing this into actual results in the tissue. This is how we get feelings to truly become flesh. Now, this science is known as biotensegrity, and it's essentially merging the biology and cellular engineering with the study of tension. And our physics is a very fascinating field. It's pioneered out of Harvard University, has worked close with Yale University. And so this is something that has, come from some of the best universities or the high horse academia universities that we're supposed to have to entrust in the field. So it's nothing woo. These are not art illustrations. This is just the type of science that is out there, but they're not giving it the publicity behind the publication, because perhaps it competes with certain industries that would rather not see this type of information out there. And the reason why I'm saying this is because there is technology already where we are assessing the force fields, right? And I'll show you some of this in the next couple screens. We're going in and we can look at the tissue, assess the force and the tension between all of these protein strings. And from that alone, we can know if this is something that is healthy or it is an unhealthy tissue based on those tension gradients. Think about not only from our assessments to be able to see things, what we can deduce from that, but also how we might correct, just the way we do with bioresonance, where we're putting back in frequencies to help balance, how we might even at a deeper point in the continuum put back a tension field to balance that tension field so that the energy waves which emanate from that actually are fixed, right? Not even us trying to bounce back that energy based on a tension state which created that. So this really is as deep as it gets. We can even look at proteins. Those of you that might be familiar with things like mad cow disease or prions, Alzheimer's can also act like this with the way that it unfolds the proteins. Essentially, those unfolded proteins are because the tension state in between all of this is actually skewed. And so when that happens, those strings move accordingly, and they may actually, the proteins within them unfold accordingly. So that geometry, not just within the whole cell and the skeleton that we'll talk about, but the actual geometry of the actual proteins, individual proteins, can be augmented. So think about how we might be able to reverse even some of these very seemingly cruel genetic diseases, right? Or that we have prion diseases that run in families and people are dying prematurely in their 30s and 40s, very sad deaths. We might be able to offer something for them. And aside from that, think about the ramifications that might mean on a greater picture for everything, something like fibromyalgia, things that are going on where there's tissue injury. I mean, it's an endless amount of things that we can do with that. So essentially, we see, again, the push-pull compression expansion dynamic here. And these strings are part of the cytoskeleton, these strings that you see here. So the cytoskeleton is much like what we have in our own human skeleton. This is kind of our framework, right? From within, the structure kind of forms outside of. And this is, again, just the professor that is very much associated with this field, Professor or Dr. Donald Ingber, who is out of Harvard University, who has kind of put together a lot of these images to really show you the continuum. So you'll see here is these are the geometrics that are elucidating the way that we can see if we were to map in a computer what's called an elastin model, right? We can measure the force fields, and from there, the computer actually recreates that geometry to show us what we are looking at. And so you see that recreated there. And in fact, that same technology we can use to do that and show us what something looks like. We go and we measure the cell physically and we see that they add up. So we really caught up in technology as far as it goes there. And so this is kind of what we see here with that geometry that's computer engineered or generated to show us what we're looking at. And then you can see that further broken down where that we have what are called the actin filaments. So these are the literal kind of protein structures, right, or fibers that we'll see that encompass this skeleton of the cell. That is what has to move, right? And there's different components of the cytoskeleton. We talk about that also in Physics Meets Physiology. I won't go into a full cellular biology lesson here, but the microtubules are a very big component of that. It's no surprise that there's also some physicists out there, and biophysicists in particular, that think that microtubules might actually be where consciousness arises from, not even from any of this other stuff that you hear out there. And so as those geometries kind of move, they create the action in the cell. Now, if you look off to this bottom left image, you'll see that there is essentially this kind of spider web looking type of, illustration. That's how we start getting into looking at what the cell itself really looks like. So if you've seen these diagrams of what a cell looks like and they look all perfect and circle with all the little parts inside, yes, we have to do these diagrams to kind of try to understand, in this 2D way of looking at things. But the truth is that doesn't look anything like that. If you actually look in cellular biology, if you're getting to look at, the electron microscopy, you're able to see something that is it looks like you're looking into outer space. It's a completely different world, right? Now, up above that in Exhibit A, you'll see that we have the green striations. You'll see that there's the red striations, and then you also see that there's the blue or the nuclei, and you'll see that same web there. So as you can see, there is the, crystallization of that tension that has tensed into those areas in those patterns. As it stays in that kind of a static format, it will form. The force forms into that field becoming kind of flesh in those particular areas. There's still this tension dynamic in those empty spaces. It's not really empty because that emptiness provides a fabric. It's still, what we would look at in biology is that water, the structured water that's going to fill the fluids, whether it's the easy water that Dr. Pollack talks about, for example, in the cells, and or if we're looking at the water that exists in our tissues. What gives it that gradient, if you want to know biologically, are something called GAGs. GAGs are what provide a density factor to the water inside of our body. The water inside of your cells, the water inside of your tissues is not the same as just, water that I'm going to, have here. Even though I did structure this, I structure mine with my Somavedic, and then I also put it on my Mayu so that I keep it in a toroid. Water really should be moving if you can have it that way. And so being able to have a structure to that water is what allows it not only obviously to stay within the confines of those, areas, but also it's what allows it to provide this fabric, that allows what you see before you to happen. That's why hyaluronic acid is my all-time holy grail supplement, because that is the most efficient way to provide a density fabric for this water in your body. And so anybody who's going through any type of physical issue in the tissues, like I said, fibromyalgia, et cetera, or you have emotional work that you're doing on to release this tension in the tissues that might be more emotionally driven, which again will probably come with physiological consequences, hyaluronic acid is still going to be that medium that allows the space in these cells to be able to have that space rather than all of those filaments collapsed on each other like this and trying to move like this to get things in and out of the cell. You want that space in between. So when they're moving, that geometry that you see is able to happen. Now, if you look at images of sonocytology, those of you who attended the Beyond the Bloodwork Summit, you'll have seen that there was, in fact, a cancer cell versus a healthy cell. And you saw that the geometry in the healthy cell was completely ordered. So it had this, beautiful kind of arrangement to it, almost seemingly like a mandala. On the side of the cancer cell, we didn't see that. It was kind of this collapsed, mess, if you will. Well, no wonder why we get cancer, right? Because when we stop business in the cell, can't open, can't close, well, what do we expect to happen, right? The thing is that we look at tissue replication and we think cancer is something that is an upregulated function. We think, oh my goodness, all these melanocytes are creating melanoma. Why though? Because as those cells actually shut down and they're not able to be efficient, the body says, okay, I guess I'll make more cells since we're not getting the results we need right now. The problem with that, unfortunately, is that this is a performance problem. It's a quality work problem. It's not a quantity. The body will say, though, if I can't depend on this quality, I have to make quantity to try to compensate. That's how we turn on things like cancer. That is why that the cellular dynamics that we've talked about can actually trigger genes to turn on or off accordingly. Different moves actually create different functions. This is a further look and breakdown at everything. And let me just see if anybody's actually, I don't think there's anybody in the waiting room, so I think we're still good. So this is an actual, yet another look or diagram at kind of how that we come to this point. You'll see that there's contraction, that's contraction. And then there's elongation. Elongation is essentially another word for expansion. So that's where we actually expand or radiate. Tension is based on those dynamics. And then there's here what you see as shear. Shear is a force, and torsion, which is a kind of twist, right? Or a spin. So all of that combines in that center hollow space to create what you see as that tissue matrix, right? And as you'll see here represented on the right, you can kind of see how all of those can be mapped in a cell, right? That's just a very basic look at that. If you look at the tumor cells, which I've also mentioned, you can see how that this is very able to create such kind of outcomes as I just described precisely because of what I have just described. On the left here in Exhibit A is much more readily an example of what a cell looks like, right? How different is that from these little circle blobs with these nicely little drawn, organelles all spaced out, et cetera. It's very similar to the physics they teach our kids in school, and probably the physics you all learned growing up in elementary school as well, which is here's the atom. It has all the little electrons nicely spaced in a shell, and it looks like this. That was, an advancement back in the early 20th century, with Niels Bohr work to map out the atom. But that's not how that translates. We don't live in a 2D world. We live in a 3D world. Things look incredibly different. They are more dynamic. There is no staticism because staticism means death. There is no life without torsion, without twist. And that requires force, and that requires a field. And the field will emanate out of something to tense against, which is the ether, which is that density dynamic, right? The whole entire world works based on contraction and expansion. We talk about this in Physics Meets Physiology, whether it is the rhythm, literally that allows for life and conception to happen. I won't go into the dynamics of that in explicit form. You get what I'm saying. Think about how a child is birthed through contraction and expansion, the very birthing process itself, right? Think about the sustenance from the breast that this child uses to continue life and nourishment from the mother. This is also a contraction and expansion with the suckling effect, right? Everything, the wave dynamics that we have in the gut, the peristalsis, the very tension dynamics that I'm teaching of how we take in information from the environment, all of it is based off of contraction and expansion, right? And that's just the beginning. That's something that we will go into at large in the Physics Meets Physiology education, where we show you the continuum of how I will give you the cosmological, physics, and we will break it down, and I will show you how that this very same thing applies to the cell, the same law of physics. We don't have Newtonian physics and quantum physics. There's a continuum. They're just different gradients of the same physics. And that's brought together by looking at a single fabric, which ties it together. But the etheric anatomical model, TM, is what I have pioneered to explain essentially the theory of everything, especially as it pertains to anatomy and physiology. And when you look at things through this lens, there's no more memorizing that you have to go through and say, well, in this situation, I would do this or that. You have a lens, you have a framework, and you put this over the information that you have, and you get to see where it fits on this continuum, so you know what tools and what portion of the continuum you might need to work with. And so with that said, this is kind of how it looks like when we have tension coming. You've ever seen cats with their hair standing up? And, we all kind of know that that means the cat's on high alert. He's getting some vibes, right? We show that in Physics Meets Physiology too, the literal hair erections that we'll get. Hair is considered another sense organ if you really look at it. The Native Americans, in fact, they have a study in the military that showed that the tracking ability that they really kind of, championed with the indigenous people was lost, and nearly completely lost when they forced them to get the military buzz cut. And the Native Americans kind of associated that quality of that knowing of the land, being able to sense direction, if you will, just as something inherent that their hair gave them the power to do. It's not just the Native Americans. Look to, the Bible, look to Samson, look to the fact that his power was very relegated to his hair, was it not? And when he lost his hair, he lost his power. So some quite very interesting metaphors with that. So when we're sensing tension here, this is first coming in through a tactile means, right? Through these force fields where we feel it in these empty spaces in the tissues, and it will then translate to tensing energy accordingly in those tissues. As we get certain developmental patterns, it crystallizes into these cytoskeletons, into where you see these fibers or the web portion of things. Let's go to the next screen here. This brings us to another subject called geodesics. This was one of my fascinations in agriculture. For those of you who don't know me or my background, originally I was an agriculture scientist. That's what I went to school for. My specialty was mostly in lasers or optics and using that with algae control and what's called bivalve farming. So essentially when you would see aquaculture booming in the early 2000s, where we were farming off of the coast with, fisheries and things like that, there weren't many rules back then. This is even when USDA organic for land farming was barely getting, put into effect with that seal, the USDA organic seal. And so the fisheries were just able to just throw whatever chemicals that they wanted out there, do whatever they wanted. And the ocean was just going even more downhill than it already, was at that time. And so they quickly made some standards as far as, what they could do. But one of the innovations out of that was working with lasers or working with light to be able to mimic the natural ability of the sun to control algal growth, especially in those kind of more, off the coast, more, I don't want to say shallow portions, but we're not fish farming in the middle of the ocean. It's obviously relatively close to the shore. And so that's kind of where, my specialty lies, is in, seafood and light, so to speak. But if we really actually look at the way that works in the body, the way that works in the body or in any organism is based on the way we receive that light. And so light is going to go down a certain pathway to get to where it needs to go. And that's where we get into talking about what's called geodesics. Geodesics is essentially mapping, point A to point B. We want to get from this portion on the globe, California, to New York. Okay, you look at that right now as a 2D map, right? But that's, again, is that how the world is? That's not. So our world is 3D. So a 2D look at that is like what you see here, right, with exhibit B. That is some flat, point A to point B. That's what's called Euclidean geometry. We learn that in, I think when we're 13 or 14 years old, but the world is not that 2D Euclidean model, right? So we have to extrapolate that and adjust for a curve factor, the torsion factor, right? And when we do that, that gives us our literal roadmap that we can map and say, when an immune system cell does this job, it takes this road, not on a flat wavelength, but that like literally curves and takes this road. That looks different in 3D, right, than we have in 2D. So as you might imagine, as we skew, if you can take this as a reference or inference that this is your tissue here, right, and this is the space in between, if we start skewing that tissue, and right here what you see on the left, even within the cell, right, within that framework, that cytoskeleton, that matrix, that lattice we talked about, if we start injuring those actin filaments, or they start becoming, too hard or too soft, and they do not have the ability to allow the message to send on the original line that it should go through, well, the show must go on. And so it's going to continue to try to push that message through. Except the difference is, if you can see this image here on the very right, I'm going to move our beautiful faces so I can myself see it. If you see this image here, let's just say that this is a pathway that something is normally supposed to take, right? Okay, well, we have a teeny bit of, tension or scarring or things like that. We'll probably still be able to get through and push that through. And this is, as it regards a laser, as it regards sound, as it regards, how we feel about people, whatever, any incoming type of, tension. But let's say that we now have some sort of major issue here where that this can no longer take this route. And now it has to say, okay, I'll go this way, detour. I still got to where maybe I wanted to go, but I had to go through some different areas. The thing is that if I have a message that's meant to be seen through this pathway and not this pathway, I might be giving information to areas that really don't benefit from that. And it also creates a efficiency issue where within the cell, we're trying to use so much more energy, right? Think about it. If you're driving from point A to point B and you are taking the scenic route or a different route than the most efficient one, you're going to waste more gas, right? You're going to put more wear and tear on the vehicle. So the same thing here. Nature's efficient. She has her patterns of geodesics where she will take the path of least resistance and the greatest flow to get where she needs to go. When there's obstacles against that, we're going to deviate the message. And so that could be, again, any type of sensation that we have coming in from how somebody might, be acting around us and how we feel. It can be therapies that we're trying to respond to, such as, laser therapy. What if that is actually going in here and instead that's actually, bouncing off scar tissue and then, going into a whole nother area of the tissue and getting stuck there? Let's say that this is a melanocyte, right? And this was meant to go into fibroblast, and this goes actually to turn on melanin instead. Great. So now we're going to start making a ton of melanin, and we're going to wonder why we have things like melasma or other stuff going on that is a message that was supposed to go somewhere else, right? And that's kind of, again, this entry level, but this is all the kind of stuff we talk about in the Physics Meets Physiology course. Let me move our beautiful faces back. And so, as you might imagine, when we really get to looking at, just the autonomic nervous system and this whole parasympathetic and, sympathetic talk, even if people are cognizant of the polyvagal theory and knowing about the two portions of the parasympathetic, and just to define for those who may not have that reference point. So we have the sympathetic, which is the fight or flight, right? That's like the portion of our autonomic, response. We don't have to think about it. The body's going to do it. To fight, right? I need to get energy that I'm going to start punching people, or, hey, this guy's too much to take on, I'm going to run, right? So fight or flight. This is a certain response that we allocate to what's called the sympathetic nervous system response. Then there is what's called the parasympathetic, and I won't go exclusively into polyvagal too much, but there's two dynamics to that. Many of us kind of associate this with simply being a, how would we say, a like kumbaya, feel good, rest and digest type of state. The truth is that we evolved to that state. As we evolved as human beings to say, hey, being nice to people avoids me getting in a fight with them. So community and socialization actually is a survival tool. We developed this portion. We didn't always have this. We originally had the parasympathetic as something that was even yet beyond fight or flight. It is there to tell the body, okay, it is Mayday. So the possum that he's playing dead. It's a matter of, let me save what little life force I have left in the event that I might actually be able to use this to mobilize one last getaway. And so in this type of what you'll see listed here as a dorsal vagal response, we have essentially a shutdown response. The body's trying to conserve resources. Blood and heart are going to get the brain and the heart are going to get the blood. Everywhere else, it's like, sorry, you're part of the budget cuts. We can't give blood to any of these other areas. Many people will be stuck in a free state who have orthostatic issues. So if you're, rising or sitting up and you feel weak, like you're going to faint, a lot of times that's because so much blood is congregated here, right? Which gives you the heart palpitation because the heart has this blood volume that's like too much. And at the same time, the periphery is here, right? Or the arms are kind of just, not able to do much. So we feel completely, out of balance. So that's the kind of the real story of the way that we look at the ANS. But even then, if you can see here, that's still selling everything short, right? Because how did the ANS get this information? Why didn't science ask this question? Because depending how we get the information, might this matter what the ANS decides to do with it, right? And that's what we talk about. That's what we just talked about there, very briefly nonetheless. On the right, you'll see kind of an illustration as far as what that looks like when we map out this polyvagal chart, as far as seeing the ventral vagal complex, which is kind of an ideal where you want to be, right? This is the feeling good, allowing the body to be in that state where we feel relaxed enough to do the repair and allow the body to kind of be in a good homeostatic point. Sympathetic, necessary sometimes. We're supposed to arouse the state in a time of threat and then go back into that ventral portion where we came from. Just like we see that gazelle running for his life. And then 2 minutes later, like after almost having just been eaten alive and torn to shreds, he's cool, back to eating like nothing happened, right? We're designed for that. However, we've evolved and we've had some kind of kinks in the system. And one of those, for both good and bad, again, beyond the scope of this lecture, is that kind of dorsal vagal activation, which can come about as a part of this stress process that we have whenever it is so chronic that we have really kind of come to a point of combustion that we can't sustain that. We can be pushed into this kind of dorsal freeze response, even if we're not in that shutdown literal dynamic of that little lizard being in the cat's, jaws type of example. Okay. This can happen even without us seemingly having something like that, impactful to create that situation. Really what you can kind of consider that is when we're in that free state, it's almost like the training ground to get into what would be shock later, right? If anybody's familiar with shock, you see the body shutting down. If you've dealt with any type of, ambulatory, work or reference point for medicine, or even in veterinary medicine, shock is the body acknowledging like there's a shutdown process coming. You can stay in that state, in the functional portion of that state, though, without it actually being shock. And that's kind of what the dorsal vagal, portion will feel like. So a lot of times we see, as you can see, the response is associated, that ventral vagal kind of response oriented here, right? The sympathetic nervous system kind of oriented here. right? We have that kind of, adrenaline rush. Well, what does adrenaline act on? The heart, right? You have your heart beating before that you even realize somebody snuck up on you. The reason why is because the ability to think things through, the conscious mind is great. We want to organize and, have meaning and context, but it's also not fast enough. If we're waiting to intellectualize things, we're going to be dead. So hence there's these responses that will come out and they're going to be mostly kind of maybe correct, but it's kind of better to act and ask questions later. Otherwise, if we ask the questions too much, we're going to be, chopped liver. But as you can see, it can become dysfunctional. And especially depending on the type of messaging system and stream that we have coming into these systems, if that is dysfunctional, what the heck do we expect to get? Any of the ANS work that you're going to be doing here, moot. It's not going to work for you. In fact, you may be creating a worse problem. And one of the biggest things that I see is that there's too many people thinking they're in fight or flight when they're not. They might be in free state. So if you are trying to suppress a sympathetic nervous system, and you are literally in that freeze response, don't you see now how you are in a dorsal freeze response? You have to come through the sympathetic to get to the ventral where you want to go. So if you keep shutting down the sympathetic, what you keep doing is turning back to where you came from, reinforcing the problem. Lastly, you'll just see that the dorsal basal complex is positioned here lower in the body. And this can cause a lot of our type of pelvic floor issues as well. And even I actually see this work up into the diaphragm. The diaphragmic stress can also be related here, even though typically we might kind of associate that with the S and S, but I do see a crossover here as well. So again, it's about so much more than just a sympathetic or parasympathetic outlook, right? This is the effect. It is not the driver. Let's move our faces over here. I think somebody is trying to join. All right, let's go into the next. So with that said, since we already covered what comes first, now let's talk about what everybody else always talks about, which is the threat signaling response, right? This ANS, and how do we kind of even get the ANS to have some of these messages? Well, I gave you my theory as far as how I think that starts first in the tensions, right? Our sensors, if you will. But conventional medicine or even functional medicine still is kind of stuck in the threat signaling to include the limbic system, which we believe is the sensory kind of input processing center. That's what is argued as kind of where we first come into creating this whole parasympathetic, intersympathetic outpour. As I've shown you, that actually has precipitory roots elsewhere. And even if we look at these systems that they're talking about here, the limbic system, the amygdala, the hippocampus, hypothalamus, what are they made of? Tissues that have what I just showed you. So what's really the deeper portion of the continuum? With that said, let's still look at it because it is part of the continuum, right? Because what I showed you with those tissue fabrics and what they create, they will feed into what we're looking at now. So it's important to understand the whole effect. So we know when we look at things, especially if you're looking at markers on our scans, what this means for you, where we are in this continuum and what's signaling what, how it's choosing in those pathways, the geodesics, right? How is your message traveling? Just because we have this message doesn't mean it travels down this pathway that everybody learns and studies in medical school. There's probably 50 other pathways it could go down. How do we know which one is our route that we're taking so that we can maybe change that? So threat signaling 101, the limbic system. Essentially, the limbic system is that very primordial portion of the brain that's going to react for you, right? Again, we can't take time to intellectualize everything. So as you'll see here, we have the amygdala kind of as who is centered to take in this information and trigger that, which via the hippocampus will come into the hypothalamus. That's where we come into actually the ANS, right? We take that sensation and we actually create vibration from that. That vibration goes to the tissues and that catalyzes certain chemical responses in correlation to those vibrations, okay? So amygdala is associated with the limbic brain and limbic response and getting that information in that we don't even have to cognitively process, because most other types of sensory input, we are cognitively processing this. It's on autopilot most of the time, but nonetheless, it happens, right? If I'm looking at something, if I'm hearing something, these are electrical signals that they become either light transduced and or sound transduced into electrical signals. And this is spoken in the electrical language of the brain. And the brain goes, oh, okay, yeah, this signal means this. All right. Oh, I saw this in 1998. This is okay. Don't be scared. It's all right. Instantaneous seemingly, right? But nonetheless, our brain's doing that for us to tell us if something's safe or not. Sometimes, though, there's going to be some information that we don't necessarily have time to process, and or maybe it's kind of going in a loop. Is this safe? I don't know. Is this safe? I don't know. And it keeps circling and circling. Those are your OCD people. The message where that the cortex will not clear information and it will keep putting it through the loop to decide, is this something I've seen before? Is this something I've seen before? And keep going like Groundhog Day. That's where the obsession with the details, fixations, order, and all that come from. That aside, though, we are built to have these two responses so that there is one that has order and context and a level of correctness, which is, kind of the priority. And the other one is just let's act, because if we don't act, then we're not going to be here. So this marriage of both, right? We have kind of the processing system that I've talked about, and that more primordial portion coming from the limbic brain, which is the amygdala that will signal to the ANS, eventually getting through the hypothalamus where the chemistry is created from that. So that's kind of our threat signaling in a nutshell. Let's look at some more information related to that, though. So what does this have to do with trauma? Well, this is where we actually segue into learning about scent, because the love language of the amygdala is going to be scent. You can see here that we have the aromatic substances. You see them coming through the nasal cavity, the olfactory bulb, how this actually will speak to the amygdala. The amygdala is really driven to be scent oriented. So we see that it is involved in the processing of odor elicited emotion and odor associated emotional memory. This facilitates odor-driven behavioral responses as well by enhancing the saliency of olfactory signals. What does all this mean? Well, how many of you have memories that you can distinctively tie to a scent? I know for me, I always say this example, but it's true because I remember back in the 90s, right? CK1 was the thing. Calvin Klein was having a moment, right? His fragrances, everybody wore them in school. So if I ever come across that smell, whatever, if I'm in a store or somebody wears that, right? People I don't think are wearing CK anymore, but that immediately takes me back literally to walking down the halls, right, of high school and remembering the jeans I would wear, the shoes I would have, how I would hold my books, how heavy they would be, the smells in the air aside from that, people's hairspray, Aquanet, all of that, right? Vidal Sassoon. And I am instantly transported there more than any image, any yearbook, any memory that somebody's telling me could ever take me to. Why? Because that's that primordial slamming of that into the very essence of your being with that amygdala. It's the unfiltered raw encoding that you have. And scent is very much primarily a part of that process. We're going to look at why. And actually, there's a lot more to it than just the amygdala as well. Everybody talks about the amygdala. I like to give love to a lot of other areas in science that nobody else is looking at. And one way that I actually do that is I don't just look for medical journals. I don't just look for latest and greatest research. I don't even just look to the research that's not actually getting the money spent to publicize it out of the best universities. But I look and I see where patents are. If you ever want a good research tip, one thing that I learned in a lot of the research that I did, which was my specialty in agriculture science, was the organization of information is that you want to look at patents. You can go look at patents for free online. Go find the medical science associated with the patents, because if they are putting money into it, it works. It's powerful. And either they're putting money into it to protect the patent, to keep it from coming to the public, or to own it and coming to the public, right? Either way, there's a money venture interest there to protect current businesses that already have solutions that they don't want better solutions to come to market to, or to be able to get a monopoly on that particular solution. Go look and see how that we can use copper peptide, and it in topical application to melanoma was shown to reduce actual melanoma cases in like a couple months. We're talking full-blown melanoma stage 4, and using copper peptide in their studies in humans that show that this has worked. There's patents on that. How come I don't see that coming out in the de novo therapies for cancer? That's a whole other conversation. But if you want to do good research, always look at the patents. And so a lot of my research, when people think like, where do you find this stuff that nobody else has? I'm looking at the patents. I'm looking to see, who are the big boys that want this, information either all to themselves or they want to keep it from everybody. That's the information that has shown that it has something to be looking at. What you see in medical journals may or may not be, something relative to the greater sphere of the truth, as far as I'm concerned. There's a lot of reasons why that things get published in medical journals, politics amongst them. And so that doesn't really give to me as much as what you'll find with the patents. With that said, let's actually look at all of that, right? So the amygdala, as I've talked about, is kind of that primordial sensing area where we can take in any type of threat assessments, and that will signal the alarm that eventually goes through to the ANS to tell the body, hey, do something. We see that the amygdala is something that typically we will have increased neuronal development with as we grow, right? Except in a couple conditions. One, where that we are autistic, and or one where that we are experiencing Alzheimer's. I have been saying for like a decade, I think, that autism and Alzheimer's are related. There's just a different breakdown in those tissue structures that we just talked about. The way that they are breaking down is a little bit different geodesics. The maps of how the point A to point B is happening are a little different. But at the end of the day, it's point A to point B, which gets shifted, and that's the decay. So and this is a whole other lecture I could give on autism, but I won't go down that rabbit hole. But what we see with these children is that as that neuronal development should be advancing, and we should be advancing this particular type of amygdala development as well, and we don't have that to match the other capacities of the brain, we're getting fed and growing in some areas that we're not actually matched with at this emotional center. And so when that happens, we have some problems because we're transmitting information. Let's say we're going with something at a 12th grade level, and we're trying to communicate that at now like a 5th grade level. That doesn't exactly go off very well. So we do see that many times these children, and also if you look at Alzheimer's patients, have tactile sensitivities. They're very particular about what touches them. They're very particular about the sensory effects that they have. And of course, we also know that there might be emotive issues as well, the behaviors that we associate with spectrum disorder, and the behaviors of autistic, or the behaviors of Alzheimer's patients as well. Anybody who might be familiar with a lot of the emotional reactivity that we see with Alzheimer's, it is because that the amygdala actually is going to become even more sensitive. And at that time, we've actually seen some neuronal, decay period at that age, but we're going to have that amygdala pick up the slack for the areas of the brain that they are not able, to do their job anymore because of the fact that they're degrading. And the amygdala has to become that much more sensitive to do so. And so you'll see heightened emotional reactions within these individuals as well. I mean, they can be reduced to crying almost like a child and regressing to that status because in essence, it's kind of almost what has happened to them. Just a little tangent there. Here's where the real meat is. And this is that we have the BNST, something nobody's talking about. It comes up in root cause clinic scans a lot. And I went through a few hundred scans and kind of put some things together based on research that's out there as well. And that is that this is really where that it actually kicks off. So the amygdala is still yet late to the game. So even if we're having the whole amygdala talk, like there's someone that sets up the amygdala. So amygdala, as you can see here, right, above the eyes, right, is where our actual threat confrontation, the signal threat alarm goes off, okay? The BNST, which is your bed nucleus stria terminalis, is where the threat anticipation, the detection, actually happens, okay? So what if it's this portion that is oversensitive that is the problem? You may be doing things to the amygdala, whether this is brain retraining, whether that this is, cognitive therapies, whether you're taking things to help, with frequency, physiologically, herbs, whatever, okay? And if it's not the amygdala, but it's who sets up the amygdala, if it is this bed nuclei, then what do you think is going to be the fact? You're not going to get where you need to go with this information, right? Furthermore, for those of you who have sinuses or eyes coming up on your scans and you're thinking, well, I don't know, I don't have a sinus problem. I mean, I feel fine, or I don't have eye problems. That's right there, the limbic brain. And if you have the limbic brain coming up on your scans, that's undeniable at that point. So think of your BNST as kind of like when you're sitting on a couch and there's a scary movie and then there's like that music that comes on and you're like, okay, I know this music means someone's going to get, massacred or something crazy is going to happen. We've been programmed now to know, like, to anticipate the threat, right? And then finally, whenever that chainsaw massacre guy comes out, like, and everybody screams, like, that's when the amygdala steps in. And that's when that jump response actually off the couch happens. But the ready to get startled response, that's what's actually the BNST. This is where what actually ends up happening within the amygdala goes off. And what can happen with individuals is that they will actually get stuck in that phase. And so they will be highly reactive. And it's not necessarily the amygdala that is going wrong here. It is that BNST. So they are always in that state where the scary music in the movie is playing. Okay, except the scary music in the movie is not playing. So they shouldn't be in this extra sensitized state. Their startle response has not shut off, right? And there's actually some correlations with this and the freeze state. So while that many in research have always attributed that amygdala to kind of being what is going to be associated with potentially a freeze response, it starts before even that. And we're going to show you some studies that actually have to do with that. So in this study, there were mice, and what they did is they actually anesthetized the BNST. So they essentially rendered that unable to be used, right? And what would normally happen with mice is that in being exposed to the urine of a predator, they would actually be susceptible to a freeze response, right? Initially, while that they first smelled that compound and then kind of processed and decided what they're going to be doing after that. But there's that innate freeze response that happens. And so in anesthetizing this, they noticed that they did not actually get a freeze response. The mice did not freeze anymore in response to this odor that there was around them. That's supposed to be an amygdala thing, right? Well, they didn't desensitize or anesthetize the amygdala. It was full intact. So technically, we should have still been able to see that freeze response take over if the amygdala is the big boss over here. Except amygdala only gets its big boss power from what is fed into it, right? Always look who feeds into who. So BNST is really where it's at if we're looking at both the amygdala and or even before the amygdala. At the end of the day, if we have anxiety, if we have OCD, if we have a lot of these other things, there is a connection here at the BNST before there is one at the amygdala. Let's look a little further into this study. So what they determined is that they were using fox urine, which these particular generation of mice had never been exposed to. Okay, these are lab rats, and they had not been exposed to foxes. However, at some point in the evolution of mice, they have been exposed to foxes, have they not? They have, right? Maybe not their direct learning environment or their generation. So hence what we're seeing here is that these mice didn't learn this on their own. They didn't learn from their great grandpappies to say, if you smell this, this is a fox. They have no idea about this from a, consciousness sphere. So what they surmise this to mean is that this was the subconscious knowledge that was innately programmed into mice so that pheromonically smelling that would still solicit what generations of mice past have known, despite it not being taught directly to them. You can see how very much of the subconscious mind is represented here as an overall part of the programming that leads to what we do, and how much the conscious mind is a part of that. There's no comparison. The subconscious mind has 20,000 bits of data that it will be able to process, while that your conscious mind processes about 7. Blows it out of the water. It's almost a joke, really. But in this study, we were able to see that essentially what they tied this together to mean is that the scent, and not just with the amygdala, but the BNST, is the pathway for the most primal conditioning, right? And with scent, the right type of scent, whether or not that this was also scent that we were able to receive with an intact BNST or not, would actually predict the freeze state outcome or not. And so if we have these freeze states, if we have even the activation of sympathetic, right? All of this is first coming through that BNST. And who speaks its language, and how do we get to being able to manipulate it? With scent. Also, too, of course, the structures and tissue dynamic of the BNST matter, because if there is unnecessary tension or the force fields, or there's problems there, if we have scarring, if there's anything that goes on within that area, then receiving that information is also a problem. And so it can go both ways. Let's go into from there. If you are interested in the language of aroma, there's actually a good film, and I actually play this in the course as well. It is cultivated by Don Goldworm of New York University, who is an internationally recognized olfactory expert. And there's some really cool stuff in there. I mean, even tying in sound and harmonics, and how that this is replicated in the color wheel, if you will, and also replicated in perfumery and or the smell of scent, right? And all that's really tied into that. So some quotes here are that smell is the only fully developed sense a fetus has in the womb. And it's the one that is the most developed in a child when the age of about 10 comes into play, and that's when sight takes over. Think about that. The primal threat detection is scent-based. Our ability to intake information, decide whether it's a threat or not, is exclusively scent-based for the most part up until our first 10 years of life. And it honestly remains still very primal. And the trump card, that's why I call it the trump card, because it will override any of these other sensory input centers. So going forward, we can use scent strategically as well to help us achieve things or balance that we're looking to do. Smell and emotion are stored as one memory. Let me let somebody in here. I'm trying to, okay. Smell and emotion are stored as one memory. Childhood tends to be the period in which you create the basis for smells that you will like and hate for the rest of your life. Anybody have a bad or negative experience with food or something and it has been burned and seared into you at this point that no matter what somebody is going to do with it, like you cannot eat this food, you cannot smell this scent, like it is just, that's it, it's a done deal for you. Well, that's because it's burned into you quite literally. Very good little documentary though, if you can watch. And now that finally brings us to the botanical segment of this, as far as some essential oils that I have chosen based on what they encompass, not just for what they have physically that can work at the physiological level, such as helping with either parasympathetic or, sympathetic mode, helping with the amygdala, helping with the BNST, but also some of their energetic qualities that they will have in the tension dynamics related to specific type of trauma patterns, right? So specific type of trauma patterns are going to have certain geodesic patterns, right? Trauma of shame versus trauma abuse, trauma of these other things. They have certain roots they take in these dynamics of the lattice. And fighting them or neutralizing them, right, is going to be achieved by a various form of tension that we have that can help to correct that. Much like what I talked about when I said that we now can produce potentially technology to correct the tension field or the force field and reset the actual anatomical alignment of the tissues. Well, we can use scent as a vehicle because of the reasons that I've showed you to be, and we can use scent, we can use sound, we can use a lot of things, right? Because it's interchangeable to a certain degree, but scent is that first on the roster of being able to kind of do so. At the retreat that we're hosting in Tulum, I'm actually going to be converting some of these essential oils via an apparatus that I have to convert what they sound like. So you will be able to hear what adaptive sounds like. You'll be able to hear what CBD sounds like. And it will make complete sense to you all at once as to why that certain botanicals create the feeling that they do. Why does helichrysum have, a bright kind of, cheery quality associated with it? Why is it associated with it being kind of the light? Well, if you hear the tempo of it, it's literally this upbeat, kind of tone. And if you hear coffee, it's the same thing. It's like a little bit of a da, 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 da. It's like, the original trance music, if you will. And if you hear things like lavender, it's this slower, nice, very soothing, or magnolia. It's all got its own tempo and, sound to it that makes complete sense as far as how it makes you feel. So that's another tangent. Let's get into now looking at the botanicals that I've chosen, and I'll tell you why I've chosen them. So some of this material is coming out of an app, and I'll show you at the end how you can get that if you'd like. But the Essential Emotions app features the doTERRA oils and has classified them based on these energetic residues or the way that they can impact kind of the force field or the tension states that we've talked about. So first of all, we have to distinguish between that fight or flight based trauma, right? And or what's going to be a freeze state trauma, because we don't want to give oils or do instruction that's going to allay a sympathetic mode. If you're in a freeze state, the body is trying to bring you through to that. That's why some of these people will have, these feelings of, anxiety. And it's not that we want to keep them there, but there's actually kind of a therapeutic push the body's testing and trying to do to push you through that sympathetic so it can get you where it needs to go, right? It's like the ANS herxing, if you will. So we have to determine whether or not we believe we might be fight or flight based trauma and or freeze based trauma. There are, obviously a lot of bioindividualities into assessing all of that. But as a good rule of thumb, if you are more the panic type, shut down, immobilized type, whenever that you are responding to the environment, you're probably in a freeze state. You're probably in that dorsal portion of the parasympathetic where you have pushed beyond the sympathetic. And so we don't want to shut your sympathetic off, right? I'm not saying I want to go out there and, stimulate that right away, although part of healing could be stimulating that, doing the exact opposite that conventional medicine or functional medicine tell you to do. This is why some people, the vagal nerve stimulation for them makes them worse, right? Because they actually don't need more of that. It's already everything that is over amplified there. We also can look at if we have a more action-oriented or overreaction-oriented type of response. Those are usually your fight or flight based people who are still stuck in fight or flight. Overall, I would say it's probably better to be stuck in the fight or flight than the freeze state. Because as you saw, as far as the continuum of things, this is, this is not as far as it could be. So if the body's still in a stage where it's like, I'm ready, let's go, I'll fight. It may be overdoing it, right? And that's also not good, but it's kind of better to be there than to be at the point of apathy where the body says, that's it. It may be the end, right? We don't want to be there. So fight or flight based trauma, I love adaptive. This is one of my favorite blends from doTERRA period. I think it's genius. I put it on every single night. I recommend you can put it on the feet if you like, but I simply just kind of put on the wrist, and I'm just using good old aromatherapy. Aromatherapy is the most powerful. Why? Because we just talked about why, right? So you can use these, transdermally and get a biochemical effect. You can achieve a biochemical effect by actually breathing that in. You can take some on the tongue orally. You can have lots of different ways in which you use these, but there's honestly no, in my opinion, no substitute for just being a good old fashioned, put it in an aromatizer effect. I like they're called organic aromas. They're nebulizing diffusers, so they do not use any water. I don't dilute my oils whatsoever. I just put the pure oil in there. And actually, I'll have to show, if you look on our Instagram post, there's actually a demo of what that looks like. It comes out with this like beautiful, just smoke in this beautiful vessel, and it will aerate the room in like less than, 30 seconds. So be careful. You don't need a lot. It will smoke you out. There's times when I'm on calls and it's almost like Hare Krishna that I'm like, too much of it going on and I can barely breathe. So for fight or flight, adaptive is my favorite. Now, adaptive oil is no surprise associated with being able to have adaptability. So the way we pivot, right, in response to stress, whether or not we can swim, whether or not we're going to surf, or whether or not we sink, right, or drown, that is an adaptability quality, right? There's always going to be resistance, and that's part of life to literally condition us. We need resistance in some form to, be able to have instruction on how to go about throughout our lives. We do not have a path of no resistance. It's maybe the path of least resistance that we'll take, but not no resistance. And so we have to accommodate for that. This is a great oil to help with that. So we'll see here that adaptive was formulated to assist with anxious states, imparts reassurance and calm when one is caught in cycles of constriction. Constriction and tension is fight or flight. Okay. We talked about how the dynamics of the universe work within contraction, expansion, sympathetic contraction, right? Muscles, blood vessels, fight, right? Sugar, everything ready, the response. Okay. What's the opposite of that? Once the body has said, can't sustain anymore, only so many resources, right? It's expansion again, vasodilation, right? So we see contraction, expansion in everything across the board. Let's let somebody else in here. And when that happens, it can happen too far along that gradient as well. And then we don't have any of that constriction. We don't have any of that tension, but you also need a certain amount of that to create the force that is life, that, allows us to exist. Both edges of the spectrum are not good, right? We want the Goldilocks effect. So when we are in that constrictive sympathetic state, you can see here, there's prolonged stress or prolonged traumatic experiences. This is a really great one to help with the hypervigilance, as you see here, so that we can kind of maybe not be as on high alert or oversensitized, albeit we still want that response when necessary. We just want it not to be, let's say, when we drop a pencil on the floor. If we're dropping, pencils on the floor, and, that just makes us want to like break coffee mugs and go crazy and berserk, we know that that's an overestimated, response, right? So that's inappropriate to the situation at hand. That's kind of a way we can tell, okay, fight or flight. There's too much constriction here because we break upon further, stress or upon further interference. So this is a favorite that I have that I love to use for fight or flight based trauma. Now, for those of you who might be in a freeze based trauma state, I like Aroma Touch. This is the one for helping whenever that we want to release the physical tension, right? And this may sound like it's the same thing as what we're trying to achieve with, helping a overly sympathetic state. It's not, because what we're trying to do here is to allow for a clearance factor so that we can, in fact, process the oncoming load. There's a little bit of a difference here. This one is really great for grief and sorrow, whenever that there is any type of tension and or stress. This one is good in the fact that it will allow for a release component, but not at the expense of putting us into a anti-sympathetic mode. At the same time, it's not necessarily encouraging you to go into sympathetic, dominance, but it's helping to not fight that either, which would be the body's natural gravitation to go through at its own speed to get to where it wants to go, which is the ventral, right? So this oil is also in tandem with the program that doTERRA teaches as far as AromaTouch, where you can learn to actually be certified in that. This, again, is something that I think is just fine to do on the wrist, right? And or do through aromatherapy. But there are actually more advanced ways to use all of these oils, looking at certain meridian points, using them in conjunction with magnet therapy, using them in conjunction with biogeometry, and allowing all of those to kind of add to the dynamic of how we're working with them. If we want to use them for generational work, for example, and some of the oils that I'm going to show, we can also pair them with these. So you can use these kind of as a base. You can use AromaTouch for those of you in the free states, Adaptive for those of you who are in the sympathetic states, and we can kind of strategically add in particular to your own type of trauma, what type of oil you want to pair with this alongside. And then there's certain tapping points. Let's say you're doing emotion code, you can actually work with that. And even if you want to go deeper into that, you can tap with a different oil for the left and for the right, because the left will refer to, a paternal lineage that is different, right? So we'll see, with the male on the right, depending on if this is a father and or mother inherited generational pattern, you'll actually want to see something applied on the left or the right, and it's not just discriminate to what is happening with you. So in Chinese medicine, there's left and right for male and female, and you can actually reverse this whenever that you have the generational kind of trauma taken into consideration. It's not the same as when we're looking at us objectively, but that's a kind of a little bit more detailed process. So that will get its own lecture, but you can get really deep into how you work with all of these oils. So let's get into the specifics that I promised as far as some of the other areas that are more particular to the type of traumas. And this is jasmine oil. So jasmine oil is really great for sexual-based trauma. So whether or not there was molestation, whether or not there was sexual assault, whether or not there's sexual shaming, such as, incompatible sexual relationships or sex use as a tool for, submission, et cetera. Anything and everything that could be related here. And it's not just for women, men included, jasmine is a great one to be able to help, whether or not that this might be something that we're dealing with as a hypervigilant expression and or hypovigilant. People, again, deal with traumas differently, right? Someone may have the same experience of being sexually assaulted or sexually molested, and they may go on to hate any notion or idea about anything with intimacy or sex. Others may hyper agitate this and become dysfunctional in the fact that they are overexpressive and or not having the proper boundaries or dynamics or healthy relationships with sex, having, partners that are the wrong partners for them or not honoring, their own limits or boundaries. So it can go either way. And this oil is great for helping to kind of reset that either way, and in conjunction with something that would foster either a, supportive, if you're in the fight or flight and or in the freeze state, can also further kind of help that dynamic. You'll see here that this is the oil of sexual purity and balance. I won't read through these in full completely because I know we're probably already we're already over an hour. So I will try to get through this, then I won't read through this, but this is something that, again, if you have the app, you can read through not just these oils that I'm talking about, but you'll actually be able to see all the oils you already have in your collection, how you can use them, what they do, et cetera, maybe why you chose them. You'll be enthralled to see the reasons, like, oh my gosh, this is so me. No wonder why that, like, I like vanilla. No wonder that I like this, et cetera. Also, you might realize reasons why you don't like certain smells. They may be, purging things in you that are hard to confront. And so naturally there's something that you maybe don't gravitate to precisely for that reason. Next up is the Beautiful Blend. I like this one for its shaming. It's for shaming type of trauma. And so with it, there are some kind of self-respect type of dynamics, and this can be something from within. I mean, all things at some point are archetypes from within. But if that is how we're dealing with our world, and that's kind of the way that we have particularly trapped our trauma from those interchanges that we have had with others, this is a really great one for helping with shaming. If you've been through, relationships where that there has been a lot of humiliation, devaluation, and this doesn't have to be just romantic relationships. It could be, paternal traumas that we have, like from our parents. It could be from, siblings. It could be from workplace. Anything or everything that might potentially contribute to your sense of value, even maybe, let's say, things that you have failed at in life. There's no such thing as an overnight success. An overnight success is still 10 years in the making. People just don't see that part before. We really punish ourselves for failure, thinking it's just supposed to be, if it's meant to be, like, it's just going to be perfect and all happen. Like, I wouldn't face these problems if I was, the next Bill Gates. How many of these people went through, and I'm not endorsing him by any means, the movers and the shakers of society that have come out with what they have come out with, it didn't just land in their lap. There's been strife through it all, right? They've just simply realized that in all that failure, they still yet were not done, right? It was, not a disconnect from still being able to be a success. And so if that is you, then this is a great oil to be able to use. You can also likewise use this on the wrist points. You can diffuse this, although this comes in the roller format, so it's a little bit different. You'd have to pop off that roller to do that. But another good way of being able to do this is on what's called the daimai. And so the girdle, it almost looks like the actual belt that is over the lower abdomen. This is your reserve of where all your unprocessed trauma goes. So when all the tissues are finally like, I'm done with this, like I cannot take anymore, like take this, like it actually goes in that lower abdomen. So no wonder why we see so much, instances and issues in the lower bowel. We see, women with their fertility issues, men even having more fertility issues. There's just so much trauma that we're not processing. And so it spills over quite literally to protect the other portion of the body, to protect the heart mainly. The body really kind of sequesters that down. And it says, you must be weighted here. Like, I can't let you see the heart or you will break it and shatter it and we won't be here anymore. And it will shatter, or crystallize downward. And so we will have all these lower bowel issues. And it doesn't even necessarily have to come out as digestion. You may just notice that, this area is just distended and it's just, full of fluid, or maybe that, we have, pelvic floor issues. There could be an insane amount of lists of things that could come to it, right? But that is also a great area on that lower portion of the belly to be able to put that as well. And even tapping on that area. I personally do tapping on and I'll have to probably do a whole new lecture on that, but I do tapping in this area, in addition to a lot of other things like the biomagnetism, geometry, and things like that. But I do that as a principal staple, and I really credit that to why I lost 14, almost 15 pounds. I have burned the candle like indiscriminately. I haven't changed that. I've always been eating well, so that's never been the thing. But in really being able to day by day say, let me deprocess all the stuff that came in, interfered with me, and let's let it go so that tomorrow I can truly start fresh and acquire those new interchanges of energy and not be, at a deficit for it. I felt so much lighter, like not just in my heart and my soul, but like in my body. And I lost 15 pounds, right? So again, I'm not saying that did everything, but I definitely think that has played a role. So from shaming type of trauma, let's look at domestic abuse. Domestic abuse is a big issue that nobody talks about. This is a great oil blend for those who might have processing or traumas associated with being abused, physical abuse, domestic violence abuse. Anybody who has been through any such altercations, there is a software and a programming that takes place. And to help kind of combat that, this is a really great blend of oils for that. You'll see that this encourages individuals for speaking up, being able to kind of have a sense of voice, which was pretty much stricken from them because it was just internalized that, there would be repercussions for that. So that is silence, that is choked out, right? And that alone can cause such, physical issues. We had a client that came to the clinic and she had 20 years of dysphagia, basically like she would almost choke. It could be hours after she eaten and she would feel like food stuck in her throat. Swallowing was stressful because, as some of you will know, we have the dynamics of the trachea to help us when we're eating, not to mix, breath and food, so we don't end up with food in the airway. But if you've got neurological issues and spasticity, and these are all popping off and opening in the wrong way, you can have that happen and it can be very scary. And so this woman had been facing 20 years of that. She would not even eat alone because she would be fearful that she could choke, right? Now, go back to her emotional scan. Long story short, what happened is that her father had, when he was dying of cancer, moved in with her when she was in college. She had just gotten married, newlywed. We already know the dynamics that changed with that. She was in college, another dynamic that's stressful. But then she actually dropped out of college to take care of her father because she couldn't do all of it. You would think that the story ends with this, like, oh, I was there for dad and I was great that I was able to do that. And I was, having peaceful moments with him. No, he was very angry and he would make fun of her and humiliate her. So hence she had, shame and all that kind of trauma. But he was very physically combative as well. But trauma and abuse doesn't have to be physical. Because he was, kind of somewhat incapacitated. So it wasn't so much as though that the threat was crazy, right? If a Chihuahua attacks you, yes, they can, puncture you, and there can be some things that aren't great, but it's not the same as like a, Presario Canario attacking you, or Pit Bull, right? Like, okay, there's some more force there. But the actual energy behind that, right? The words that he wielded, he would tell her to shut up. He would call her stupid, and he told her to go choke because she was overweight, and he told her to go choke on a ham sandwich because she happened to make ham sandwiches for him all the time. And so if you really think about it, this woman, what did her body do? She was told to choke. She was told to shut up. So she did. Well, her body did for her anyways. We worked with her with some essential oils. We did a lot of frequency for her, and she did emotional work. And that's what set her free. She had done 20 years of protocols. Nothing would ever work for her. And finally, she was able to get better doing that. It just goes to tell you that the tension tells the tissues what to do, whether that you consciously know about this or not. This is the plan. This is the orchestration of how it works. Let's go to the next. How many of you have had stressful births and or deliveries? Birth trauma is also something that is widely rampant these days, especially as people become more open to the idea of the fact that there's options outside of just birthing in a hospital. They kind of don't even realize, what might have been wrong, right? Unless that they have this other reference point. But as more people do get the reference point, more women that they are cognizant of the other available options, they might, in hindsight, be perplexed at how they feel about this birthing, experience that they've had. And so this is a great oil, not just for birth trauma, but actually for female, hormone balancing in general, menstrual cramps, et cetera. Those of you who might have endometriosis. So there's a lot of things that this can be really great for. But this is good for the vulnerability. So anytime that we've had kind of a breach of when we were, in a spot where we really kind of needed people to make the decision in a way that we thought should have been made, and it didn't get made that way. Now, albeit there might be decisions that got made in a way that we don't agree with, and it wasn't because the person did not have our best interests in mind. Maybe they really did, but their dynamic is different. They're a literal different tissue force field than you. So their mindset is different, right, than yours. And so it may not be a personal thing. The person didn't intend to harm you, right? I mean, many of these physicians out there, they're doing what they believe that they should do, right? And so it's not this type of malice per se. Nonetheless, trauma, as we talked about, is not something that you have done to you per se, so much as what is remaining and how you feel about what has been done to you, right? What is left after that. So this is really great for those of you who have been through any type of traumatic birthing experiences. And then there is what I call the single mom and or the provider trauma. Perhaps this is one of the most under-discussed points of emotional tension. We have many fractionated families, and that is putting, unequal stress in those that might be raising children. And a lot of that does fall on mothers. There are a lot of single moms, not to say that there are not single fathers out there as well, any single parents really, but having to be both, first of all, mom and dad, bringing the nurturer yin qualities, feminine qualities, and having to also bring the disciplinarian protector and our masculine provider qualities that we associate with to the child, and to do that in harmony between one person is extraordinarily difficult. I mean, even to put, food on the table and a decent roof over our own head these days is increasingly difficult. And now with these times of the recession, everything is just even harder. This is a constant gerbil wheel. And no one ever talks about this because it's been so mainstream now that it's just accepted, right? But consider the ramifications of this. Now, I'm not saying anybody should stay in relationships that they don't want to be in, not by any means, right? But we are designed to be in these communities and in these networks. Literally, your family is a field. It's an extension of you. And by not having them, we are shifting the dynamic. That's too much tension for one source to bear. I love Northern Escape for the single mom, the provider trauma. This is the transition oil, if you will. So that is a whole different transition if we think about going from that dynamic. And let's just say that there was never the other parent in the picture. Never was there the mother or the father in the picture, and it's always been you from the start. Going from not having kids to having kids is a transition. Any parent will know that your life is never again the same, right? And so this is very grounding oil. I love this oil to diffuse whenever I'm actually working, because it will help me to recognize when the burnout is no longer allowing me to be productive, and whenever I should probably sleep or wind down and get up the next day and try fresh again, because normally I'm a workhorse and I will keep going. But this helps me to be better in tune with a grounding dynamic so that I can recognize when I have the mental self has kind of separated and detached from, the physical self. You need those to be in balance to be able to recognize the harmony between the two. And many times when we have these type of traumas, the single mom, the provider, we live in the mind because we cannot get to the point of the feeling, because if we get to that point of the feeling, all hell's going to break loose and we will shatter and we will not provide for our kids. We will fall apart and we can't even bear the thought of that, right? And so this is a way of acquiring kind of that grounding to be able to be in touch enough to acknowledge that portion of us without it collapsing us, which I think is very important, because I likewise don't believe that, processing of emotions and tension release has to be something that, is this crazy, over the top experience. Subtle energy is subtle. I mean, some of the signs and things that we get aren't this, the light coming out of the sun and the clouds and everything spinning around. Sometimes it's as subtle as just seeing one synchronicity and realizing, wow, this was put in my path to see the connection between all of this. So it doesn't have to be this experience that is like that. It can be a small thing day to day, so long as that you keep moving in that direction to oppose what's interfering with you that is not productive. Because the truth is that all trauma has actually been to serve you. It wouldn't be there if it wasn't information vital to your survival in the long run. How you feel and the trauma and tension that you get from this keeps you providing for your kids, is it not? You're tired as hell, but it keeps you putting food on the table, which keeps you surviving. So there's a purpose to that. It's just we have to look at what's the motivational purpose and energy and tension that we want to keep, but the portion that's kind of collapsing us that we don't want to keep. If you are OCD, for example, this could be paralyzing your life. You could be nitpicking your relationships and you could be unhappy with everything. And maybe as a boss, like you're hard to work for and all this other stuff, which is really causing you major problems, right? But at the same time, do you want to strike from the record all that OCD? No, because that's also what makes that person a brilliant accountant. We can't take away all of it. You have to take away what does not serve you, and you have to keep what does. And lastly, we come to the protector-based trauma. And this one is geared again at anyone who could be in this role, could be mother or father, or anyone in a relationship where we are trying to coddle and or protect somebody from themselves even. So family members who are kind of having or dealing with members in their family that might be substance abuse users, trying to protect them, trying to, be somebody to be the lookout, right, for that person. And, or of course, what many men are going to resonate with in the fact that there is this expectation, right, that we have from the male archetypes to be the protector. And so this can weight on men in a way, the protector type of role, and it can be the source of many an inadequacy or sense of inadequacy. This can also happen whenever we have a survivor's guilt, so to speak. So I've had a client that they actually witnessed their brother being murdered and they froze in the moment. They, could have helped their brother and they have guilt about this years later, 20, 30 years later, because in that moment they were just paralyzed, like they couldn't do anything. And they feel that they are responsible for their brother's death thereafter, being a bodybuilder, literally a person that knew how to fight, okay? And they couldn't do anything in that moment. And so they live with this, and it has made them sick, literally, for 30 years. And so there's that protector instinct, right? A lot more, again, we'd say inherent supposedly in men, but can be for a mother too. What if there's a mother who something happened to her child and now she has this type of response that, somebody touched her child and, she thinks that she's responsible for this because she wasn't there for that second or she turned her eye for that second. There's still that association there. Vetiver is one of my favorite oils, period. One of the best grounding oils that you can use. I like this at the base of the spine. Literally, don't get it into the butt crack, it might burn, but just as far, just as low as you can really there, while still on the actual main skin cutaneous membrane. That is amazing for grounding. Vetiver just speaks to my soul. It's such a grounding type of aroma, really good for helping to balance. But this is one that's also, somewhat masculine. So men don't necessarily mind it as much. It's usually used in a lot of the male fragrances. It's got this musky type of grounding scent. It is centering. And as you can see here, it helps us with roots, just as I said, kind of coming back down. and getting outside of this kind of, riled up outside of this base type of energy that can happen when we over process, and or hyper process an event. Sometimes we have to come back down into the physical self, and kind of ascertain those energies to anchor us back into the present, because we're living, literally too much in the past. So this is another oil that I really like. Kind of, again, one of my main favorites that I put in a lot of PowerPoints because I love it so much. Has so many different, good things and qualities that it brings to the table. Here's the app, Essential Emotions. I think it's $15. You can download it and it will have all of these oils categorized by either what oil they are, and you can look up what they do. As in physiologically, tea tree, let's say for fungus, candida, all of that. You can also look at the emotional qualities. So let's say tea tree, for example, will also tell you, yeah, it's anti-parasitic. It helps the candida, but it also helps with parasites in your life period. So maybe there's, a person who's a parasite. So boundaries is really associated with tea tree oil. It puts a boundary between you and that which is not you, which is why it works for something like candida. So these bioactive botanical properties are just, again, crystallized chemicalizations of that etheric template, which is the actual energy, the software that we've talked about, right? How they create tension in the field. And if you've enjoyed this lecture, this kind of content is 1,200 slides worth of lectures. We have about 30 hours of lectures for just the actual lessons. And then we have lab breakdown where we go through and actually look at markers and talk about how this is an example of this, and that. We will be getting that actually published in our portals in this upcoming week. We had a snafu with all of the animations that we had, but our editor has been able to fix that. And so we should be back up and running here by this week, which I'm very excited to launch. There's also the built-in support that we have to be able to offer you if you have questions alongside going through your data or alongside the lectures. You have lifetime access to being able to ask those questions in our Facebook forum, where you will learn from myself, our team, as well as the others in the group, because we can always be our best learning resources, just sharing amongst ourselves. There's also office hours every other week. So there is some FaceTime where we can do the visual demos and be in touch as well. And we have some activities incorporated, such as sound baths, different biomagnetism demos, and the like, other experts in the field speaking and showing you how to bring some of these things that we talk about in the educational experience to life. You will graduate with the ability to be a certified biophysics practitioner, which will allow you to use our lab and be able to also be potentially able to submit for a other credential, because we are looking to get this actually approved by various different boards. And so you could then belong to those particular boards as well. And there's also the ability to receive reduced pricing so that you can offer this to yourself and or your clients if you're doing this work as a practitioner, where that you can then make substantial commissions off of, doing the testing, receiving it at a discounted rate, and being able to actually, make that difference up in your own income as well. So that is what I have about today. If anybody has any questions, let me go into full screen. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take them now. Or if not, hi, Meryl.
Hi, this is Meryl. Hi, Veronica. Sorry, I'm driving, but so it's I found the whole lecture so fascinating. Some oils I find them so strong, like rose. I know it's supposed to be like high frequency, but it literally gives me a headache. Even helichrysum. Is that I'm just curious.
Yeah, so you can totally, herx from the oils, right? And that's because they're combating something. So a great story that I have to illustrate that is when I reference tea tree. Most of the time when I make examples, it's because it's the first thing in my mind, because it's something that's actually happened. So we actually had a client. She had this nasty candida rush and it was not going away for anything. She would use tea tree and it would make it worse. And she would, say, I can't do this. It's making it worse. I can't be this itchy and stuff. And finally, she kicked out this kind of deadbeat boyfriend who wouldn't get a job. She was working 2 jobs. He wouldn't even take care of the dog. So she finally was with this itchy rash, right? Annoyed and that's it. I'm over it. Get out. Right. And she'd been kind of pacifying that for a while, but this particular week where that all the tea tree just made this so much worse is when she got the motivation to be out. Right. After that, the tea tree no longer gave her any issues and this rash started to heal up. So if you look at it that way, it was literally causing that tension to come to a culmination so that we could reprocess that energy and create something different, right? And then it had a different effect with her. But you can absolutely meet resistance with certain oils, and you may not like them for that reason, because they can provide, and it can go both ways. They can provide an imparting tension, which is just not homeostatic for your natural rhythm or whatever you need. But there's also that fact that they could be correcting things. So it's kind of like, you take the bitters, right? For, helping your liver or your stomach to produce what it needs to, and it doesn't like taste great. You're not like, yeah, although I am, because I love bitter things. I'm a freak like that. But normally our body would be like, ugh, but it's part of the process. So it can be for either of those reasons.
Cool. Thank you. Also, a family member who suddenly got diagnosed, I think most likely is stage 3 or stage 4 of the big C, the cancer thing. Is there any essential oil that comes right off the top for someone who is with cancer? We don't know exactly, must be the lymph, or when you say it's the lymph is affected heavily. So that's all we know right now.
Sure. Yeah. I would probably recommend a trio of spikenard, myrrh, and frankincense. So those have so much leverage, like in just so many areas in which they reach. But there's also a lot of power in that synergy. It's kind of, said to be kind of like the 0 point where that we get, life force, if you will. They're mentioned even, in the Bible, and there's plenty of literature throughout like a lot of other cultures as well that kind of talk to them. I'm a big believer in just not some of the parts, but like the synergy that comes between them. So those are always great for kind of a reset. If you're looking to kind of say, let's go back to ground zero, not like I want to add in a potato to take the salt out from the soup that's now too salty, but like, how do we just undo stuff? That's a good one. I really like, that. Also, copper peptide is very good. I mean, not universal. Cancers will be different. So it really kind of also depends what they're dealing with. But like I mentioned, the copper peptide, for example, that's research that has patents all over it right now, because they're seeing that like they can put this on deadly melanoma. And in 2 months, the person, their melanoma is gone. Like they don't even have to cut it out. They're not giving them chemo. They're not giving them nothing. And these are people. First, they started it on horses, and they started it on animals, and then rats. And now they did this on people. And so there's a lot, that we can do. I would say those are a good starting point. And then depending on what particular, other things we may see in their scan, we could look at that as well.
Yeah, the person is in India, so it's kind of hard from there. But so frankincense, myrrh, and the other oil was?
Oh, I'm sorry. Spikenard and myrrh.
Spikenard.
Myrrh
Okay.
was also something I put in the COVID kit that we did, because that's really great to be able to kind of protect those pathways. And actually, that's another point that I didn't even get to make that I forgot, is that if you look at the consciousness factor and the subliminal and the subconscious factors that we talked about today, and how scent is attached to the subconscious self, and you think about how we have had a, incident the past 3 years where this is quite literally an attack that is well associated with the scent of smell or interfering with it. Think about what that's doing to our subliminal and subconscious programs. By detaching us from like that inner ability to have those, sensory processing that we would in an organic state, interrupting that, is it that reason why we're seeing, society be able to just shape themselves to all these mores and, new cultural norms that like 5 years ago we would have thought were insane, but now it's like, that's how it is. I think that that's not a coincidence there either, but myrrh is a really good one. Myrrh has good protectional qualities. In fact, it's commanded to us to use that against things like mold, to use in our house to protect it from that, not just physically, but the actual energy associated with mold. If you see Dr. Emoto's work, he has, the rice that's pretty and nice and fermenting that he said, I love you to. Then he said bad things to the other one, and it's a black rice. And then there's the decaying and gross mold rice, right? That nobody spoke anything to. So we tend to think of like, negative energy is the worst thing possible, but negative energy is still energy. That's why people will do things, right? That is, perhaps bad, but they don't care. They still get attention for it, right? Reality TV is a good example of that. People don't care, right? But, you know, if you don't have any energy, none, then you have nothing. Merritt has said console came up very strong on your previous scan. You got migraines at first when using it. Now you love it. See, you are pushing through that. That's a perfect example. And we also talk in the course, everyone, about what's called biphasic reaction. So the dose is everything, right? Stuff may come up on your scan, and typically 2 times a day is what we want to go with. And the drops that come up for you is what we should kind of use. But if you find yourself having some resistance to that, it's okay to go slower, because smaller dosages stimulate, middle kind of moderate dosages inhibit, and large dosages are associated with killing. Now, if we want to kill something, then what do you think? Yes, we kind of keep going until we get to that killing effect, right? That's part of not just what we're using, like what herb or what frequency, but how much of it. Let's say that we want to inhibit something. Well, we want a moderate kind of dose. And let's say we want to just spark something or ignite it. We want a small dose. Things change though, because as we actually get a result, let's say from that small dose, now we may need a little bit more to keep maintaining that type of a effect, right? Or on the other end of the spectrum, let's say that you're doing great, and then all of a sudden you have some symptoms and you're like, I was doing so awesome. I felt like, I mean, everything was, you know, cured and I was great. And now I actually have like a clearing crisis. Okay, well, we were at that level. And now what you're taking, even if it's the same amount that you took from 2 weeks ago, now that level is not low enough. It's actually, you know, something that is too high. So we have to lower that down, even if at first you were taking a higher amount. So we can look at the biphasic scale as well to see how we need to use things. So if there's, you know, something that we have a response to, it's not just what we're taking, but how that we want to look at. Lavender is your favorite scent. I love lavender too. That like helps just tranquilize me to kind of calm down. You seem to be allergic to it. Should you avoid it, or is there a way to get rid of the sensitivity? How have you been using it so far? Is it just something that you have in the diffuser? Because if so, the aeration, if that's setting you off, then we may need to look at sinus pathways, inflammatory pathways that you have, and or if this is something you're using topically. If it's used topically, it can cause some dermatitis if it's too potent. So if you're not already trying to, I don't think you put to dilute it, you can try to dilute that. I also think that the moisture levels of the skin are everything. They always talk to you about using a carrier oil, like to dilute it, but if you have hydration problems, if your tissues, as we just showed you, don't have that extra space, all that oil plugs, and it plugs up at the top, or it plugs in there, and that creates this sludgy effect, right? Things don't move. So you need the hydration. Hyaluronic acid is my favorite supplement in the whole world. I've been taking it for 20 years because of that reason. Not just for its ability to plump your skin and help with cellulite or wrinkles or this or that. With that said, I'm 40 years old. I have no wrinkles, and I don't do any Botox or none of that junk. I've done lasers. I've done definitely my gadgets. I have, and I do some good skincare, but I never developed those wrinkles or those breaking points because my tension game was always intact. I always gave the buoyancy so that these strings of the tissues never had to crystallize and get hard and create those pivots that you see that are wrinkles, right? So hydration is very important, not just any hydration. You can be drinking plenty of water and then you won't see this effect, right? So you want something to structure that. Hyaluronic acid is one way. It's my favorite way. There's also chondroitin sulfate, heparin sulfate that you can use. Those are also what are called gags. Drinking actual structured water you can use. There's, you know, quite a few different things and tips and tricks you can put up your sleeve, but hydration allows that to work. If you don't have that hydration, if you don't have that space in between, your cells are collapsed. And so, yeah, then the lavender oil might just sit and trap in there, and it's like, boom, in your face in the cell. And that's just going to produce an inflammatory response. All right. Any other questions from anybody? Hopefully everybody enjoyed today's lecture. All right. Well, then I guess that's a wrap for today. Excuse me. We'll be having some more events here soon, so stay tuned for that, everybody. If not, have a good rest of your weekend. Bye-bye. Thanks, Martine. Thanks, Merritt. Bye, everyone.